Imagine a world where silence could cost you your limbs, and truth wasn't something spoken, but something dragged out of your joints, inch by inch. Let's start with number 20. In a stone chamber beneath a fortress, torchlight flickers over a wooden frame taller than a man, its ropes coiled like sleeping serpents, waiting to be awakened. This is the rack. Not a quick execution, but a controlled dismantling of the human body. A lesson in how far sinew and will can stretch before both finally snap. Used across late medieval Europe, from royal prisons to inquisitorial dungeons, it was the device kings and inquisitors trusted when whispers of treason needed to become signed confessions. You are stripped and bound, wrists tied high at one end, ankles at the other, rough hemp already biting into skin. The executioner does not rush. He turns the crank with the patience of a carpenter tightening a beam. At first, it is only tension. A pull across the shoulders, a pressure in the hips. Then comes the shift, ligaments tearing like wet cloth, cartilage shearing, shoulders wrenching from their sockets. The body lengthens, but not cleanly. Muscles fray, joints grind, and every breath feels like it scrapes along splintered bone. Blood loss is slow, deliberate. The real injury is invisible, buried deep in tendons and joints that will never fit together correctly again. Victims were sometimes stretched over multiple sessions, taken off the rack just long enough to live in the terror of knowing they would be fastened back onto it. Number 19. The collar of spikes, a cage you wear. If the rack tore you apart all at once, the spiked collar destroyed you one movement at a time. In late medieval and early modern Europe, heavy iron neck collars, lined with inward-facing spikes, were clamped around prisoners whose crime was defiance, blasphemy, or simply angering the wrong lord. The collar sat high on the shoulders, its jagged teeth pressed against throat, jaw, and the base of the skull, transforming the simple act of existing into a series of choices between stillness and agony. Even the small twitch of a swallow sent steel digging deeper, embedding itself into swollen flesh. Victims could not lie down without driving spikes into their necks. Sleep came only in short, panicked snatches, if at all. Infection followed quickly. The iron rusted inside wounds. Flies laid eggs in ragged punctures, and the constant trickle of blood weakened the body long before it gave out entirely. Some prisoners were paraded or chained in public places, turned into living warnings, as townsfolk watched them tremble, every breath a negotiation with pain. The collar rarely killed quickly. That was its design. It turned days into a slow ritual of humiliation, a punishment that left no grand spectacle, only the memory of a ruined, sleepless face. Number 18. The scavenger's daughter, the iron fist that closed inward. Where the rack stretched bodies toward breaking, the scavenger's daughter crushed them in on themselves like a collapsed star. Forged in 16th century England under Henry VIII, this A-shaped iron frame forced the victim into a crouch, knees drawn up, chest folded, head pushed down, limbs bound tight so that bone ground into bone. Once locked, there was no shifting, no finding a position that hurt less. Every second layered pressure on ribs, spine, and lungs until the body felt like it was trying to implode. Breathing became a shallow, stuttering effort. Blood surged to the head, bursting vessels in the eyes and nose, staining faces a mottled purple-black. Chroniclers wrote of prisoners in the Tower of London fainting within minutes, only to be revived and compressed again, the cycle of consciousness becoming its own form of torture. Unlike devices that shattered bones in obvious ways, this one specialized in invisible ruin, torn muscles, crushed organs, and long-term damage that left survivors broken without a single clean fracture to show for it. It was the rack's dark mirror, the kingdom's promise that whether your body was pulled apart or folded inward, the crown had an instrument for every kind of suffering. Number 17. Burning at the stake. Justice written in fire. When rulers wanted not just obedience, but belief, they turned to flame. Burning at the stake turned town squares into theaters, where justice, fear, and faith all burned together in the same smoke. Across medieval and early modern Europe, heretics, so-called witches, and traitors were marched to wooden posts driven into packed earth, surrounded by bundles of wood chosen as carefully as any weapon. Green logs smoldered longer, choking victims in thick smoke before flames even reached flesh. while tar and pitch were added to feed both fire and the crowd's horror. The condemned were bound tight, sometimes with chains, sometimes with rope that would itself ignite as the fire climbed. Those considered slightly fortunate were strangled beforehand. Others felt every stage of the inferno unfold. Skin blistered, hair curled and caught, eyes swelled and burst under the heat. From the fringes of the crowd, families watched as their kin were transformed from person to silhouette to collapsing ember. In England's Marian persecutions, and on the continent's witch-hunting fields, these fires were meant to linger in memory long after they died down. Their smoke used as a language the authorities spoke fluently. Defy the church or crown, and your beliefs will not just be refuted, they will be burned into ash in front of everyone you know. Number 16. Pressing the weight of silence. Some punishments began not with a crime, but with a refusal to speak. In late medieval and early modern England and France, peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, was imposed on those who would not enter a plea in court. The law could not properly try someone who refused to answer, so it crushed their will instead. The prisoner was stripped and laid on bare ground, a wooden board lowered across chest and belly. Then came the stones, first small, then heavier, stacked until the ribs bent and the chest could barely move. Every additional weight made breathing a negotiation with suffocation. Bones cracked, lungs struggled for space, and the heart labored against the pressure. Some victims lasted hours, others days, their bodies slowly flattening under the mounting load. Historical cases recount people choosing this method deliberately, dying under hundreds of pounds of stone so that, technically unconvicted, their property might still pass to their families. In that grim loophole, pressing became more than torture. It was a final, lethal bargaining chip between a person and the state, in which silence itself was punished with the crushing force of the law, made literal. Number 15. Crocodile shears. Treason's final bite. Treason demanded more than death. It demanded mutilation that would echo in rumor long after the body was gone. In late medieval and early modern Europe, iron tongs forged like the jaws of a beast were heated until they glowed, then clamped around the most vulnerable parts of a traitor's body, fingers, toes, or, in the most infamous accounts, the genitals. Once the metal had bitten deep, the executioner wrenched back hard, tearing flesh, pulverizing bone, and sometimes ripping whole portions of the body away in a single obscene motion. Crowds did not need imagination. They saw, heard, and smelled everything. The hiss of flesh against hot iron, the sudden spray of blood, the screams that cut through market noise, all of it turned the punishment into a civic lesson. For those condemned for murdering or plotting against kings, mutilation with such tools was often only one act in a longer execution, paired with flaying, quartering, or burning. The message was clear: raise a hand against the sovereign, and that hand, along with everything that made you a man, might be fed to red-hot jaws while the realm watched. Number 14. Strappado. The fall that never ends. In certain courtyards and halls, the sky itself became a weapon. The strappado, favored by inquisitors and secular authorities alike from the late medieval period onward, began with a simple position: hands tied behind the back, wrists bound with rope. The rope then passed over a beam or pulley, and the victim was hoisted upward until toes barely touched the ground or left the earth entirely. Then came the drop. Not a fall to the floor, but a sudden slackening and jolt that tore shoulders from their sockets and sent searing lightning through nerves from neck to fingertips. Some variations added weights on the ankles, multiplying the violence of each jerk. Records describe prisoners fainting from the pain, only to be revived with water and lifted again. Bones could tear through skin, joints might never heal, and paralysis was a common result. Public squares sometimes hosted these hoistings, turning the creak of rope, the crack of ligaments, and the roar of the crowd into a single, terrible chorus, designed to make anyone watching reconsider resistance. Number 13. The branks, a cage for the tongue. Not all medieval punishments spilled blood in rivers. Some aimed at dignity in speech, cutting into identity instead of limbs. The branks, or scold's bridle, spread in Scotland and parts of England in the late medieval and early modern period as a device meant to silence troublesome women, those accused of gossip, slander, or simply speaking too much in a world that valued their obedience more than their voices. The device encased the head in an iron framework, fitting like a grotesque helmet. A flat plate, sometimes studded with spikes, forced its way into the mouth, pressing down the tongue. Any attempt to speak or even swallow could drive metal into soft tissue, cutting and bruising until lips, gums, and tongue were raw. Victims were paraded through streets or chained in marketplaces, the clanking of iron announcing their shame long before they were seen. Passers-by spat insults, threw refuse, and laughed. While the restrained could do nothing but endure, the physical wounds might heal. The memory of being turned into a walking warning against speaking one's mind did not. Number 12. The garrote. Death by turning the screw. Execution can be a spectacle of noise, shouts, prayers, the thud of a falling body, or it can be disturbingly quiet. The garrote, used in Spain and elsewhere from the late medieval period into the 19th century, embraced silence as its instrument. A solid chair, an iron collar fixed to a post, and a screw or lever at the back were all that was needed. The condemned was seated and fastened, their neck cradled by cold metal. As the executioner turned the screw, the collar tightened, compressing the throat until breath narrowed to a thin, desperate gasp. In some designs, a sharpened bolt or wedge pressed into the spine or the base of the skull, and a final powerful twist could crush vertebrae and sever the spinal cord in an instant. Spectators stood close enough to see eyes bulge, lips darken, but there was no dramatic drop, no flames, no flying limbs, only the measured, relentless constriction of iron. For authorities, this combination of apparent cleanliness and undeniable terror made the garrote a favored tool when they wished to end lives without the chaotic theater of a hanging crowd. Number 11. Pillory and stocks. The mob's playground. Some of the most insidious tortures relied on ordinary people. The pillory and stocks, found across medieval and early modern Europe, locked a person into a wooden frame by head, hands, or feet, then surrendered them to the mercy or cruelty of everyone who passed by. In busy markets, those condemned for theft, fraud, blasphemy, or moral offenses became living targets. Rotten food, stones, and filth rained down. Jeers cut as sharply as rocks, and the trapped could not even lift an arm to shield their faces. Hours stretched into days, with exposure to sun, cold, and rain adding their own silent punishments. Teeth were knocked out, bones fractured, and there are records of prisoners dying where they stood, skulls broken by a single well-aimed projectile. Even those who survived carried the scars, physical and social, long afterward. In a world where reputation was everything, being seen powerless and humiliated before neighbors could destroy a life just as effectively as any sword. Number 10. The coffin cage. A body on display. The so-called coffin was not a box, but a cage that turned a human being into a hanging exhibit. Iron bars were bent and riveted into a rough human shape, torso, limbs, sometimes even a crude head, and then sized to hold a prisoner with almost no room to move. Used in parts of Germany, France, and England, these cages might suspend the living or the newly dead from gallows or town gates, letting them sway in the wind as a constant reminder of crime and consequence. For the living, the torture began with immobilization. Stripped of clothing, exposed to sun, wind, rain, and winter air, the confined body quickly stiffened. Joints locked, flesh chafed against iron, and birds or insects took advantage of the easy meal. Some victims were smeared with honey to attract swarms of wasps and flies, transforming the cage into a buzzing cloud of stings and bites. Without food or water, death eventually came by dehydration, exposure, or sheer exhaustion, but the body could remain in place for weeks, ribs showing through thinning skin, eyes pecked away. The cage did not just kill, it made sure no one could look at the city gate without seeing what awaited those who crossed the line. Number 9. The knee splitter, breaking the will to stand. To take away a person's ability to walk is to erase their freedom in one brutal motion. The knee splitter, appearing in the later medieval and early modern periods, was a compact device built for that purpose alone. Two opposing bars, wooden or metal, were lined with spikes or teeth, then clamped around the knee, front and back. Once locked in place, screws were tightened, dragging the spiked jaws together. At first, the skin dimpled, then split, and the spikes punched through flesh into the joint beneath. Cartilage tore, the patella shattered, and ligaments shredded under the pressure. Some versions were applied to both knees at once, ensuring the victim would never again stand without assistance. Interrogators might use the device early in questioning, knowing that even if the prisoners survived, they would leave the dungeon as something less than they were, a limping, crawling testament to the cost of resistance. The knee splitter did not seek a spectacular death. It aimed for a lifetime of remembered pain. Number 8. Tearing and burning. The human beacon. At sea and in port towns, punishment often had two audiences: the condemned, and every sailor who might one day consider mutiny or desertion. Tarring and burning fused torture with maritime symbolism. The victim, often a pirate, mutineer, or sailor convicted of serious offenses, was stripped and bound to a mast or post. Boiling tar, used to seal ships' planks, was ladled out not onto wood this time, but onto living skin. The tar clung and cooked, sealing burns beneath a sticky black shell. Every breath drew in the reek of scorched flesh and pitch. Sometimes, that alone was intended as punishment. In other cases, the suffering escalated when the tar-soaked body was set alight, turning the condemned into a shrieking torch visible from the decks of nearby ships. Even after the flames died, the charred remains might remain in place, a dark figure against the sky, to greet every returning vessel. The message needed no translator: betray your crew, your captain, or your flag, and the same fire that keeps ships afloat will be the fire that consumes you. Number 7. Thumbscrews. Pain in the palm of a hand. Torture did not always require large machines or towering stakes. Sometimes, the most feared tools fit easily into a gaoler's pocket. Thumbscrews, small clamps designed to encase fingers or thumbs, spread through Europe in the later medieval and early modern periods, used by inquisitors, jailers, and even ship captains eager for quick answers. Two metal bars with holes or slots framed the digits, and a screw tightened them together. Each turn crushed bone a fraction more, flattening nails, cracking joints, and forcing blood and tissue out around the edges. Some variants added spikes inside, so that compression both smashed and pierced at once. Victims watched their own hands deform in front of their eyes, knowing that another half-turn could destroy their ability to write, work, or even feed themselves. The device's power lay not just in agony, but in control. An experienced interrogator could drag out the process for hours, loosening just enough to keep the prisoner conscious, tightening whenever answers slowed, until resistance shrank to a whimper, and finally, to a broken confession. Number 6. The chair of nails. A throne of agony. From a distance, it looked like any other solid wooden chair in a chamber of judgment. Up close, it was a forest of iron. The chair of nails, or chair of torture, used in parts of Germany and elsewhere from the later Middle Ages onward, was plated with hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 metal spikes along the seat, back, armrests, and even footrest. Prisoners were stripped and forced down onto it, then strapped tight so that every attempt to move only drove the spikes deeper. Some versions allowed the spikes to be heated until they glowed, turning the device into a fusion of impalement and branding. Bleeding was surprisingly slow. The spikes were narrow enough to puncture without causing immediate, fatal blood loss, so victims could remain conscious for hours, even days, as nerves screamed and infections took hold. Interrogation often took place while the condemned sat on this iron garden, questions timed to fresh surges of pain. To onlookers, the scene carried a cruel symbolism: the accused, enthroned, but in reverse, crowned not with honor, but with steel and fire. Number 5. The iron gag. When breathing becomes the enemy. The tongue is both weapon and witness. The iron gag was built to seize it and turn every breath into a punishment. Across parts of Europe, from the late medieval to early modern periods, this device appeared as a heavy metal bit, or plate, forced deep into the mouth, often with sharpened edges or studs. Straps or locked bands anchored it around the head, sometimes chaining it directly to a wall or post. As the victim struggled to swallow or gasp, the metal scraped against the palate and throat, cutting soft tissue and provoking choking fits. Blood and saliva pooled, dribbling down the chin as speech became impossible. In some cases, swelling of the tongue and surrounding tissue could narrow the airway until suffocation loomed. Authorities used the iron gag in public shaming walks and in interrogations, where silence was as much the goal as pain. The person behind the device ceased to be a voice and became only a pair of terrified eyes, learning that even the act of inhaling could betray them to agony. Number 4. The drunkard's cloak. Wearing your crime. Not every medieval and early modern torture spilled guts onto dungeon floors. Some wrapped the offender in their own ridicule and let the weight of public scorn do the rest. The drunkard's cloak, used in places like 17th century England and parts of continental Europe, was typically made from a large barrel or similar wooden shell, with holes hacked out for head and arms. Those punished for public drunkenness were forced into the confined space and paraded through streets. The hollow casque amplified every stumble, turning the condemned into a living caricature. Children laughed and threw mud. Adults cursed or mocked. Inside, the prisoner struggled with heat, cramped limbs, and the constant drag of the heavy wood. Long punishments meant standing or shuffling for hours, sometimes in winter cold, sometimes under harsh sun, unable to sit or lie down. What began as comic shaming could end in exhaustion, collapse, or illness. Long after the barrel was removed, the memory of walking one's own village as a human joke could haunt a person standing more deeply than any scar. Number 3. The Spanish tickler. Unraveling flesh. Some instruments were designed less to restrain than to erase. The Spanish tickler, also known as the cat's paw, looked like a simple metal claw. 3 or 4 hooked prongs attached to a handle, sometimes heated until red hot. Interrogators in Spain and elsewhere dragged it down a prisoner's body, from shoulders to thighs, shredding skin, tearing muscles, and sometimes exposing bone in long, jagged furrows. The device did not kill quickly unless wielded that way. Instead, the tormentor could control every stroke light enough to flay only the upper layers or hard enough to rip deep into tendons. Victims were typically chained upright, forced to watch the tool approach again and again, knowing each pass would carve another avenue of torment into their flesh. In some executions, the tickler was used in stages, interspersed with other pains, turning the body into a map of overlapping cruelties. Even surviving such an ordeal was its own sentence, as infection and disfigurement marked the victim as someone the authorities had once chosen to unmake. Number 2. The breaking wheel. Bones on the spokes. If the rack fragmented the body in secret chambers, the breaking wheel did it in the open, under blue sky and 1,000 watching eyes. Across medieval and early modern Europe, criminals sentenced for murder, banditry, or grave offenses were tied to a large wooden wheel or laid beneath it. An executioner with an iron bar or hammer systematically broke the limbs, arms, and legs, smashed at multiple points until they resembled twisted cords rather than limbs. In some regions, the shattered body was then woven through the wheel's spokes and hoisted onto a pole, left to die slowly from shock, blood loss, and exposure. Birds settled on the unmoving form, crows pecked at open fractures, and travelers saw the figure from roads and fields for days or weeks afterward. The wheel became not merely a method of execution, but an emblem, appearing in art and legend, as a symbol of both earthly justice and divine punishment. To see someone bound upon it was to be reminded that law could reach not just your life, but the very shape of your bones. Number 1. Scaphism. Death by 1,000 mouths. And then, there is the punishment that seems too grotesque to be real, yet lingers in ancient accounts and medieval retellings. Scaphism. Originating in tales from ancient Persia and whispered through later chronicles, this method embraced nature itself as the torturer. The victim was wedged between 2 hollowed-out boats, or tight wooden planks, body-trapped while head, hands, and feet protruded into the open air. Force-fed milk and honey until the stomach rebelled, the condemned was left floating or fixed in stagnant water, their excrement collecting around them, their skin smeared with more honey to attract insects. Under the unblinking sun, flies, wasps, and other vermin swarmed, biting, stinging, and laying eggs in every sore and wound. Days stretched into a nightmare of fever, infection, and slow decay. Flesh rotted while the victim was still conscious, mind trapped inside a body, becoming its own feeding ground. Whether every detail recorded by ancient writers is exact or embellished, the image endures. A punishment so drawn out so intimately cruel that it feels less like execution and more like being handed over to the raw, indifferent hunger of the world itself. You've just walked through 20 ways the human body was turned into a message, but the worst stories are still buried in forgotten cells and unmarked graves. If you want to keep uncovering how power, fear, and cruelty shaped our past, subscribe to Execution Stories and step back into the darkness with every new episode.